The metallic click of handcuffs echoed in the still night as Olivia Carter stood silent. Her tailored suit rumpled, her wrists bound. Her piercing gaze didn't waver, even as Officer Barnes smirked, circling her like a predator. "Well, another criminal off the streets," Barnes sneered, his voice dripping with misplaced authority. Olivia's voice was calm yet firm. "You've made a grave mistake. Do you even know who I am?" Barnes chuckled, his confidence unwavering. "Oh, I know. You're just another punk in a fancy suit trying to talk your way out of trouble." Olivia met his gaze, unflinching. "No, officer. I'm the chief prosecutor for this state, the woman who's about to turn your world upside down." Barnes froze for a split second, then recovered with a scoff. "Yeah, sure. Tell it to the judge." Behind Barnes, Officer Grant shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Olivia and his partner. "Grant, stop fidgeting and get in line," Barnes barked. Olivia glanced at Grant, her voice low but pointed. "You know this isn't right. Do the right thing while you still can." Grant's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Olivia was shoved into the cruiser, the cold leather seat pressing against her. As the engine roared to life, she silently vowed that this injustice would not go unanswered. The quiet suburban streets of Woodrest were cloaked in silence, save for the faint hum of streetlights casting long, jagged shadows. Olivia Carter, tall and composed in her navy suit, walked briskly with a leather briefcase in hand. After a grueling day of meetings and trial preparations, she longed for the solace of home. The weight of the briefcase felt heavier than usual, though its contents were routine, legal documents meticulously prepared for a high-profile case. Her thoughts raced ahead, replaying tomorrow's strategy with careful precision. Every detail needed to be perfect, every argument airtight. Turning onto a familiar street, Olivia exhaled, her pace steady. The road ahead was quiet, lined with tidy houses and the occasional parked car. But the tranquility shattered when headlights appeared behind her. A police cruiser approached, its red and blue lights flooding the street in urgency. Olivia stopped instinctively, raising her hand slightly to signal she wasn't a threat. Her calm demeanor betrayed no fear, though the sight of the flashing lights stirred unease. The cruiser slowed, and two officers stepped out. Officer Barnes, stout and imposing, was the first to speak. "Evening. What are you doing out here this late?" His voice carried a tone of suspicion. Olivia met his gaze calmly. "Walking home from the office. Is there a problem, officer?" Barnes folded his arms, a cynical smirk spreading across his face. "Got a call about a burglary. You fit the description." Olivia blinked, stunned by the accusation, but maintaining her composure. "A burglary? I've just left my office downtown. I'm a lawyer." Barnes chuckled humorlessly. "A lawyer, huh? What's in the briefcase? Stolen goods?" Olivia's patience thinned, though her voice remained steady. "It's legal documents. You're welcome to check." Without waiting for consent, Barnes snatched the briefcase, rifling through its contents. He smirked as he held up a stack of neatly organized papers. "Looks like someone's trying a little too hard to look innocent." "This is harassment," Olivia said firmly, her tone rising slightly. "I haven't done anything wrong." Barnes's smirk deepened. "That's for us to decide. Turn around, hands behind your back." Olivia's calm shattered. "On what grounds?" "You have no evidence." Barnes grabbed her roughly, snapping handcuffs onto her wrists. "Resisting an officer, for starters," he growled. Behind him, Officer Grant hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for his radio. "Dispatch, we're bringing in a suspect," he muttered, his eyes avoiding Olivia's. Olivia was forced into the cruiser's back seat, the cold vinyl pressing against her. Silent and resolute, she gazed out the window, her anger bubbling. She wasn't just another person being wrongfully detained. She was the state's chief prosecutor, and this injustice wouldn't stand. The drive to the station was suffocating, the cold air inside the cruiser amplifying Olivia's simmering anger. Her wrists were bound tightly in handcuffs, and every bump in the road pressed them painfully against her back. Barnes's smug comments filled the silence, each word meant to provoke. "Thought you were smart, huh?" Barnes sneered, glancing at Olivia through the rearview mirror. "Guess not smart enough to avoid this." Olivia remained silent, staring out the window, her jaw tight. Fear had no place in her mind, only resolve. The cruiser rolled into the station's parking lot, the harsh fluorescent lights of the building casting long, eerie shadows. Barnes yanked the door open, pulling Olivia out roughly. "Let's go," he barked, shoving her forward. Officer Grant followed, his discomfort visible in the way he avoided eye contact. The station's interior was cold and unwelcoming, a cacophony of ringing phones and muffled voices filling the air. The faint smell of disinfectant mixed with stale coffee added to the oppressive atmosphere. Barnes led Olivia to the booking area, his confidence growing with every step. "Empty your pockets," he barked, but he didn't wait for Olivia to comply. With careless hands, he reached into her coat, pulling out her wallet and phone. He tossed them onto the counter with a thud. "Wallet, phone, briefcase," Barnes said to the clerk, who logged them with casual indifference. Olivia watched silently, her frustration mounting. "You're making a mistake," she said firmly. Barnes leaned in, his smirk unwavering. "You keep saying that. Maybe we'll see who's really made the mistake." Olivia's composure didn't falter. "You'll find out soon enough," Barnes chuckled. "We'll see." Olivia was escorted to a holding cell, its steel bars cold and unwelcoming. The walls were peeling, and the air was damp and heavy. She sat on the hard bench bolted to the wall, her thoughts racing. She wasn't just thinking about her freedom, she was already planning her next move. Through the bars, she heard Barnes boasting to another officer in the hallway. "Another one off the streets," Barnes said, his tone filled with smug satisfaction. "Can't wait to see the look on her face when the court throws the book at her." Olivia's hands clenched into fists, her anger barely contained. The woman who had spent her life dismantling systemic racism was now its victim. She took a deep breath, channeling her fury into determination. Meanwhile, Officer Grant lingered near the booking area, his unease growing. His arms were crossed tightly and his jaw clenched as he watched Barnes type up the charges. "Burglary, resisting arrest, possession of stolen property," Barnes muttered to himself, embellishing every detail to fit his fabricated narrative. Grant hesitated before stepping forward. "Barnes, don't you think—" Barnes cut him off with a sharp glare. "What? You have something to say?" Grant shook his head and stepped back, his silence louder than any words. Sitting in the cold cell, Olivia took another deep breath. Her anger had crystallized into resolve. She wasn't going to let this stand. This wasn't just about her. It was about exposing the corruption that allowed men like Barnes to abuse their power. The cold air in the holding cell seemed heavier as hours dragged on, but Olivia Carter's mind remained razor sharp. She paced the small space, her thoughts focused on the next steps. Fear and frustration gave way to resolve. This wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about exposing the truth. When the guard finally arrived, he opened the cell door with an indifferent grunt. "You've got one phone call. Make it quick." Olivia stepped out, her demeanor calm but purposeful. She dialed a number she knew by heart, waiting only a moment before the line connected. "Rachel," she said, her voice steady but firm, "I need you to bring everything. This is worse than we thought. They fabricated the entire thing." On the other end, Rachel, her trusted assistant, didn't waste time with questions. "I'll be there as fast as I can," she replied, her tone sharp and resolute. Hours later, the station's oppressive silence was interrupted by the sound of determined footsteps. Rachel stormed in, a stack of documents and evidence tucked under her arm. Her presence was commanding, her eyes sharp as they locked onto Officer Barnes, who lounged behind the counter with his usual smug expression. "What's this?" Barnes asked, his tone dripping with mockery as Rachel approached the desk. "Proof," Rachel said coldly, dropping the stack of papers in front of him. "Proof that my client wasn't anywhere near the alleged crime scene. You fabricated this entire case." Barnes's smirk faltered as he flipped through the documents, his confidence wavering. "We'll see about that," he muttered, though his tone lacked its earlier bravado. Rachel didn't back down. "You've already lost. The evidence is airtight, timestamps, video footage, and records that place Olivia miles away during the supposed burglary. Release her, or you'll have a much bigger problem on your hands." Barnes hesitated, glancing toward Officer Grant, who stood silently nearby. The younger officer's discomfort was clear, his gaze fixed on the floor. After a tense pause, Barnes relented, motioning to the guard. "Let her go," he muttered, his voice tinged with irritation. The cell door creaked open, and Olivia stepped out, her composure unshaken. She collected her belongings, meeting Barnes's glare with quiet defiance. "This isn't over," Olivia said, her tone low but resolute. Barnes scoffed, but the unease in his expression betrayed him. As Olivia walked out of the station with Rachel, her resolve burned brighter than ever. "Thank you," she said to her assistant. "Now we go to work." Her freedom had been restored, but the battle was just beginning. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the seats filled with spectators, reporters, and legal professionals eager to witness the spectacle. Murmurs rippled through the gallery, but all fell silent when Olivia Carter entered. Dressed in a sharp-tailored suit, she exuded quiet authority, her every step deliberate. She carried her briefcase with precision, her calm demeanor commanding attention. All eyes followed her as she approached the defense table, where Officer Barnes sat. Barnes lounged back in his chair, his smugness palpable. His confidence had grown since the arrest, bolstered by Patricia Reynolds, the district's formidable star prosecutor seated beside him. Known for her no-nonsense, tough-on-crime reputation, Reynolds sifted through her notes with meticulous focus. Beside Barnes, Officer Grant fidgeted, his discomfort increasingly evident. He avoided eye contact, his movements stiff as he adjusted his tie. The judge entered, her gavel striking sharply to bring order to the room. "Court is now in session," she announced, her voice firm and commanding. Reynolds rose confidently, her opening remarks sharp and calculated. She painted the charges against Olivia as indisputable, her words aimed at convincing the jury of a clear-cut case. Barnes leaned back in his chair, smirking at every sentence. But Olivia remained calm. When Reynolds concluded, the judge turned to her. "Ms. Carter, are you ready to proceed?" Olivia stood, her voice steady and resolute. "Your Honor, I will be representing myself." A ripple of astonished murmurs swept through the courtroom. Reynolds' confident expression faltered for a moment, and Barnes sat up straighter, his smirk replaced by unease. Olivia wasted no time. "The prosecution claims I was at the scene of the alleged crime," she began, her tone calm but deliberate. "However, the evidence I present will show otherwise." She opened her briefcase and retrieved a USB drive. The courtroom screen flickered to life as a video played, security footage from a nearby ATM. The timestamp clearly showed Olivia miles away from the alleged crime scene. The silence in the room was deafening as the jury watched. The evidence was undeniable. Reynolds stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. This footage hasn't been verified." The judge raised her hand. "Overruled. Continue, Ms. Carter." Olivia nodded and addressed the jury. "This footage alone disproves the timeline presented by the prosecution. But there's more." She handed a second piece of evidence to the court technician, an audio recording from the squad car on the night of the arrest. As the recording played, Barnes's mocking voice filled the room. "Just make it look legit," he said, laughing. "No one's going to question it." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Barnes shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier bravado disappearing. Reynolds stood again, her voice sharper. "Objection, Your Honor. This recording—" "Overruled," the judge interrupted. "Proceed," Ms. Carter. Olivia turned back to the jury. "The recording you just heard isn't taken out of context. It reveals clear misconduct by Officer Barnes and a blatant abuse of power." Barnes leaned toward Reynolds, his whispers urgent and angry. Her earlier confidence was now visibly shaken. Olivia continued, presenting each piece of evidence methodically and leaving no room for doubt. By the time the judge called for a recess, the courtroom was visibly rattled. Barnes slumped in his chair, his smirk completely gone, while Reynolds frantically reviewed her notes. Officer Grant, meanwhile, looked like he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Olivia returned to her seat, her calm composure unshaken. The prosecution's case was crumbling, and the cracks were now impossible to ignore. The courtroom reconvened with an air of palpable tension. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, reporters scribbled furiously, and the jury watched with a mix of curiosity and anticipation. All eyes were on Olivia Carter, whose calm yet commanding presence contrasted starkly with the nervous energy on the prosecution's side. Officer Barnes sat stiffly, his usual arrogance replaced by a thinly veiled panic. Patricia Reynolds, the prosecutor, was uncharacteristically flustered, flipping through her notes as though searching for a lifeline. Officer Grant's discomfort had reached its peak. His trembling hands and darting eyes betrayed his inner turmoil. Olivia stood, addressing the court with steady confidence. Your Honor, the evidence presented thus far establishes my innocence, but it also reveals something far more troubling, a pattern of misconduct that cannot be ignored. She gestured to the court technician, who began playing a new audio recording. The courtroom fell silent as Barnes's voice echoed from the speakers. Just make it look legit, Grant. No one's going to question it. She fits the profile. Case closed. The audience gasped. Whispers rippled through the gallery as Barnes jumped to his feet, his face flushed with anger. That's taken out of context, he shouted, his voice trembling with desperation. The judge struck her gavel sharply. Order in the court. Officer Barnes, sit down immediately. Barnes slumped back into his seat, his earlier bravado completely shattered. Olivia turned back to the jury. The recording you just heard is undeniable proof that Officer Barnes fabricated evidence and manipulated the situation to frame me. This isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a larger issue of systemic corruption. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Then she addressed the bench. Your Honor, I call Officer Grant to the stand. All eyes shifted to Grant, who froze in his seat. Barnes shot him a glare filled with silent warnings, but after a tense moment, Grant stood. His steps to the witness stand were hesitant, his body language revealing the inner conflict tearing him apart. As he was sworn in, Grant avoided eye contact with Barnes and Reynolds, focusing instead on Olivia, who approached him with calm deliberation. Officer Grant, Olivia began, her voice steady. When you and Officer Barnes stopped me that night, did you have any evidence linking me to the alleged crime? Grant hesitated, his lips pressing into a tight line. Finally, he shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. No. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Olivia pressed on, her tone firm but not aggressive. Did Officer Barnes instruct you to fabricate evidence to justify my arrest? Grant swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edges of the stand. He glanced briefly at Barnes, whose glare could have cut steel, before taking a deep breath. Yes, he admitted, his voice trembling. He told me to make it look legitimate. I knew it wasn't right. The room exploded with noise. Spectators gasped, reporters scribbled furiously, and Barnes leapt to his feet. He's lying, Barnes shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. This is a setup. The judge struck her gavel repeatedly, her voice cutting through the chaos. Order, Officer Barnes, sit down or be removed from this courtroom. Barnes sank back into his chair, his face pale and his confidence shattered. Olivia turned back to Grant, her expression softening slightly. Thank you for your honesty. One last question. Why didn't you speak up sooner? Grant looked down, guilt etched across his face. I was scared, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. Scared of what would happen if I went against him. But I couldn't stay silent anymore. Olivia nodded, her tone encouraging. Your courage today matters. It's never too late to do the right thing. Turning to the judge, Olivia continued. Your Honor, Officer Grant's testimony, combined with the evidence presented, makes it clear that this case was built on lies and corruption. There's one final piece of evidence I'd like to submit. She approached the bench, handing the judge a file. This is my resume, she said, turning to address the courtroom. Confusion rippled through the gallery as Olivia continued. Before the officers arrested me without cause, before they fabricated charges, I was preparing for this week's trial. You see, I'm not just a lawyer. I'm the chief prosecutor of this state. Stunned silence filled the room. The weight of her revelation hung heavily in the air as the judge reviewed the file. I will not stand for corruption, Olivia declared, her voice rising with conviction. Not in my office, not in my state, and certainly not from those sworn to uphold the law. The judge called for a recess, but the damage had been done. Barnes sat frozen, his face a mask of defeat. Reynolds avoided meeting anyone's gaze, her earlier confidence reduced to ashes. As Olivia returned to her seat, the fallout from the courtroom revelations was swift and devastating. The once confident Officer Barnes, who had wielded his badge with arrogance, now faced an internal investigation that unraveled years of misconduct. Complaints poured in from others who had suffered under his abuse of power, each one painting a grim picture of a man who believed himself untouchable. Within days, the police department, under intense public and media scrutiny, issued a formal statement. The chief of police condemned Barnes's actions, announcing that he had been stripped of his badge and would face criminal charges for fabricating evidence and abusing his authority. Barnes's career was over, his name synonymous with corruption. The man who had smirked at Olivia Carter's arrest now sat in disgrace, watching his reputation crumble under the weight of his own lies. For Officer Grant, the outcome was different. His testimony in court had been the turning point, his honesty providing the jury with undeniable proof of Barnes's corruption. While Grant wasn't absolved of his role in the injustice, his willingness to speak the truth earned him leniency. The department placed Grant on probation, paired with mandatory ethical training and oversight. It was a second chance, a rare opportunity to rebuild trust and prove that he could serve with integrity. Olivia, however, didn't stop at clearing her name. With her position as chief prosecutor, she filed formal complaints against the department, demanding a deeper investigation into systemic issues. She pushed for reforms that would hold law enforcement accountable, including mandatory body cameras and the establishment of independent oversight committees to review cases of alleged misconduct. The media followed every step of the unfolding story. Headlines highlighted Olivia's bravery, portraying her as a symbol of resilience and justice. News segments replayed key moments from the trial, while op-eds praised her determination to confront a broken system. Outside the courthouse, Olivia addressed a crowd of reporters and supporters. Cameras flashed as she stood at a podium, her voice steady and passionate. "This case was never just about me," she began, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. "It's about a system that allows officers like Barnes to operate unchecked. It's about the countless victims who never had the chance to fight back. And it's about the responsibility we all share to demand accountability." The crowd listened intently, their expressions a mix of admiration and determination. Olivia continued, her voice rising with conviction. "This isn't the end, it's only the beginning. Change doesn't happen overnight, but with perseverance and unity, we can create a system where justice isn't just a promise, it's a reality." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing across the plaza. Olivia stepped back from the podium, exchanging a nod with Rachel, who stood nearby with a proud smile. Meanwhile, Barnes sat in his now empty home, watching the news coverage with a scowl. His arrogance had been replaced by bitterness, his downfall broadcast for all to see. For Olivia, this wasn't a moment of personal victory, it was a call to action. Weeks later, as police reforms were introduced and accountability measures implemented, her resolve only deepened. Olivia's name became synonymous with justice, her story inspiring others to confront corruption in their own communities. The road ahead would be long, but Olivia was ready. The fight for justice had only just begun.